storyteller, and he's here with a great story. Please give it up for Raymond Wlodlowski.
Great to be back, thank you. When I heard the song Wildflowers, I thought of something that is more than you expect, something unexpected, and something that someone that has some way been untethered, like a child you might think of. And that made me think of my friend David. And the first time I saw David was in the early 70s, and it was at a school psychologist meeting in Milwaukee. And the reason I noticed him is because the rest of us had suits and sports coats on, but he had a short sleeve shirt on. And he was a burly fella, and he was what we used to call a no-neck. So his head sort of went into his shoulders. And he had a white t-shirt on that went up to where his Adam's apple should have been. And he had a Fu Manchu mustache. And when he asked a question, it was like Luca Brasi with a high-pitched voice. And I thought to myself, mobster. You got a mobster psychologist here. And I looked at the fellow who was next to me, and I said, who's the mobster? And he said, He said, he's probably the foremost play therapist in all of Milwaukee. And I just, was surprised by that. And so I saw him about 5 weeks later, and I went up to him at a party, and I said, my first impressions of him, and he roared with laughter. He was so pleased by that. And then he shook my hand, and we had what I'd call, it's like a micronistic fission or something. And we became friends on the spot. And after that, we started looking for things to do together. And in about 3 years, we had our first adventure. Now, one of the things I learned about David over the years was that he was a person who, well before me, had a child creep into his soul, a 10-year-old boy, and it never left. He just was delighted with things and how they occurred, and easily saw things that made him feel amazed and in awe. And I never knew that in any other person, especially at like about 40, 45 years of age. So we did our first raft trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon for about 11 days. And we enjoyed that so much, we decided that the next summer we'd go out to Rocky Mountain National Park, and we would take what is called, at that time, Rock 101. So we actually did rock climbing for an entire week, learned the skills, and then went back to Wisconsin and practiced in Devil's Lake, at Devil's Lake. And when we were doing that sort of thing, we said, well, what should we do next? So the next year, we said, let's try parachuting. And this is the mid-70s now, and there weren't rock climbing walls or anything of that nature. And we had to sort of find a way by which we could get better at it. And then the parachuting idea came upon us, and we went out to a place in Menominee Falls and just signed up because it said, practice in the morning, jump in the afternoon, and $75. And that seemed worth it. So now, we're about 5 minutes from our destination, and David looks over at me and he says, here's what I want you to tell my family in case I die. And I waved him off. I said, this is not the time to discuss that. And we get into this Quonset hut, and there's parachutes all over the tables, and they're the old-fashioned kind, the kind you see in World War II movies. And there's 4 skydivers there, and they show us a video, And essentially, it's a video of the person who's the instructor in this plane with an open area right on the side. And instead of jumping out, what he does is he climbs on the wing. He takes a grip on the left, puts 2 feet onto a strut, puts a grip on the wing, brings his hands down for another grip on the wing, and then he just throws himself backwards. And I'm thinking, not only is that difficult to do, but how fast is that airplane going? And so I just kind of had all these questions start to come up. And he takes a break from the video and he said, "Are there any questions?" And I said, "Well, how fast is the airplane going?" And he says, "Well, we start out about 115 miles an hour, and then we slow it down to about 95 to 100 miles an hour." And I thought to myself, when's the last time I went 95 to 100 miles an hour? And I was about 16 years old with my friend Larry Brzezinski in a DeSoto, and it almost fell apart. So I'm thinking, okay, and I have another question. How many people get hurt doing this? And he looks at me and he says, "What do you mean by hurt?" And I said, "Well, you know, broken ankle, a dislocated shoulder." And he says, "About 10%. And I just didn't like those odds. And I said, and he probably saw my face drop. So he looked at me and he said, "No, listen, if you take this seriously, if you practice, if you do what we tell you to do, the odds are about 100 to 1. It's only the people who get foolish and think it's a lark that really get in trouble." He said, "There are only 2 things that can really hurt you. The first is if you land in the trees. Then you can break your neck and get pierced by the branches. And the second thing is if you pull your auxiliary chute before 6 seconds go by, because then it'll float into your bigger parachute and you'll drop like a rock." And in the second half of the video, they actually had a video of a person falling like a rock. So now I really have my doubts. And I take a look at David, he's looking straight ahead. And what that tells me is he's going to go through with it. So we practice religiously. It had us count to 60 at least 50 different times, 1001, 1002. So we would become automatic with it and be able to count. And after the morning 3 hours of training, which was good training, they chose the 2 of us to go first. And everybody else is like 25, 21-year-old. David is now close to 50, and I'm about 35. And we get into the airplane, take off, we're flying, and I'm just trying to get past my doubts, past my fears, past my anxiety. And I remember standing up and going to that opening and looking back at David. And it's the first time I saw concern on his face. And I knew that concern was not for himself, it was for me. And it moved me. It made me more committed, more motivated. And I just said, I'm going through with this. And I grabbed that handle, and I did what I was supposed to do, and then I flew off that wing. Now, I've never had another experience in my whole life like this, but to drop in the sky is overwhelming, extraordinary. I didn't even count the first 2 seconds because I was so overwhelmed by it. But I knew to get to 1003, 1004, 1005, and before the eye was out of my mouth, that parachute popped, my straps went rigid, and I started to float. And that was another great feeling. And I look about 65 yards over there's David. He's doing the same thing. And then they start talking to us on the walkie-talkies because they got to get us back into the middle of this meadow. And that's not a problem. I'm doing it. We're going back over. And then I look at David, and he's heading in a beeline to the woods. And I hear the man's voice, the instructor's voice, start to change. And I could feel the fear in that voice. And then at about 1,500 feet, I see the two other instructors, and they're running pell-mell toward the woods where David's going to land. And I got that sick feeling in my finger, in my stomach, I should say. And I just, in time, saw the ground, buckled my knees so that I'd absorb the shock, and instead of pulling in my parachute, I just ripped it off and started running toward the woods. Now, there was a rise, and I couldn't see beyond it until I got over it. And then I had about 75 yards to the woods, but the sun was in my face. So all I could see were two men climbing into the trees to get down the parachute, and then hanging at the bottom of V was the body of David. And I just kept running. And about 10 yards, I hear his voice. And it's Chipper. And he says, "Hey, Ray, wasn't this a great jump? My feet didn't even touch the ground." And I see these two guys looking at each other, and they're saying, like, "You just almost got killed, man." So then we drive back to Milwaukee, and we both decided we didn't need to do this again. We weren't so very good at it, and we let that one go. Now, on February 8th of this year, at 91 years of age, David passed on. He was in a good place. His children were with him, his family was with him. I was able to talk to him on the same day. And this is what I think I've learned from this and from some other good friends that have passed on. When you're close, we were friends for 48 years. When you're close for that long, that other person enters your soul, just like that 10-year-old boy entered David's soul. And it isn't so much that they're out there hovering over you, but they're a part of you. And it's in the way we see things, in the way we understand things, in the way we think about things. And David's been with me through some of my worst moments. He's been with me when I whimpered, and he's been with me when I soared. And he's with me now. And we're having a good time. So thank you. We wish you friendship.